I did not bang the table or cry. I simply checked my watch, listening to our young CEO say, "We need a strategic mindset restructuring." Before calmly placing my badge down, they thought they were just firing a strategy executive. They had actually snapped the balancing wire of a logistics empire built on debt and blind faith. Stepping out of the building, I knew the truth. One system shut down, and this entire company would choke itself to death. My name is Leah Gonzalez. I am 38 years old, and until very recently, I held the title of Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy at North Spire Freight Systems. If you have ever driven down an interstate highway in the American South or the Midwest, you have inevitably been boxed in by one of our heavy transport vehicles. We are a logistics empire, a sprawling, bleeding, sweating network of warehouses, dispatch centers, and corporate acquisitions stretched out across Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, and Georgia. It is an unforgiving world built on diesel exhaust, cracked asphalt, and razor-thin profit margins. I did not get to the C-suite by making pretty slides. In the corporate hierarchy, there are essentially two types of strategists. The first type exists in a sterile vacuum of high-level theory, building pristine presentation decks that predict uninterrupted, upward growth. I am the second type. I am the mechanic who climbs into the engine block while the truck is still tearing down the highway at 70 miles per hour. My true specialty is post-merger integration and extreme risk control. Over the past 7 years, North Spire attempted to swallow two massive competitors, and both times, the deals nearly killed us outright. I was the one who went into the dark belly of those failing acquisitions, ripped out the financial rot, and painstakingly rebuilt the structural architecture so we would not drown in their hidden debt. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in El Paso. When you are raised watching your parents stretch a single dollar until it screams, you do not tolerate operational waste, and you certainly do not tolerate corporate fairy tales. I started my career in finance, studying the hard, cold numbers, but I quickly realized that a financial ledger is just a shadow of what is actually happening on the ground. I shifted to operations strategy because I wanted to touch the exposed nerves of the business. Over time, I developed a specific reputation among the executives. People say my memory for detail is terrifying. I can recall the fuel surcharge variance from 3 quarters ago or the exact square footage of a defunct cross-docking facility in Nashville without looking at a screen. But my real trademark in the boardroom is a single, uncompromising question that I ask whenever a shiny new initiative is proposed. I always look the presenter dead in the eye and ask, if this system is cut, what dies first? For a long time, the only person who understood the absolute necessity of that question was our founder, Marlene Wexler. Marlene is a woman made of iron and cold steel. She built North Spire from a single dispatch desk into a multi-state behemoth through sheer force of will. Marlene did not care about optics. She cared about survival and cash flow. She treated me as her second brain. We spoke the exact same language of risk, exposure, and reality. We spent countless nights in the corporate war room. Marlene would sit at the head of the table, an oxygen tank resting quietly beside her leather chair, while I mapped out the collateral liabilities of whatever distressed asset we were trying to absorb. We knew that logistics is not about moving boxes. It is about anticipating catastrophic disasters before they happen. But iron eventually rusts, and even the strongest hearts eventually give out. A severe heart condition forced Marlene to step back from day-to-day operations and retreat to the board of directors. Nature abhors a vacuum, and corporate boards abhor a lack of dynamic optics. To fill Marlene's heavy shoes, the private equity fund that backed us parachuted in Graham Bellamy. Graham is 32 years old. He looks exactly like what a mid-tier casting director would choose to play a visionary modern executive. He has perfect hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and a smooth, hypnotic way of speaking that makes you feel like you are standing on the bleeding edge of tomorrow. He was plucked directly from the frictionless world of high-end growth consulting. Graham has never stood on a loading dock at 2 o'clock in the morning in freezing rain, trying to figure out why a union dispute is holding up $2 million worth of perishable freight. He has never had to explain to a regional bank syndicate why a debt covenant was technically breached but practically sound. Graham did not begin his tenure with obviously disastrous operational decisions. That is not how his type operates. He began by changing the corporate vocabulary. He brought in an army of boutique consultants who wore designer sneakers and charged $5,000 a day to tell us what we already knew. He replaced our operational reality with a lexicon of beautiful, empty noise. I sat in the executive conference room during his second week, watching him pace in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at the senior leadership team and smiled with practiced, radiant warmth. "We need to move away from legacy thinking," Graham announced, his hands gesturing expansively. "I am launching rapid growth workshops across the enterprise. We need narrative-driven leadership to improve our margins. This is not just a structural shift, team. This is a full operational reset." I remember looking around the heavy mahogany table. The heads of sales and marketing were nodding vigorously, utterly mesmerized by the performance. The chief operating officer looked like he was trying to mentally translate a dead language. I just stared at my legal pad. I knew instantly that we were in profound, existential danger. Graham did not understand how Northspire actually made money. He did not understand the brutal, unforgiving physics of our supply chain. He did not know that our profit margins were held together by complex fuel hedging strategies and hyper-specific route optimizations that took years to perfect. To Graham, a company was merely a financial instrument, a narrative to be packaged, polished, and sold to the next round of investors. He only understood how to make a presentation deck look as though we were on the verge of changing the world, regardless of whether the trucks were actually rolling out of the yards. This was never a simple conflict between the heroic underdog and the villainous boss. Corporate warfare is rarely that clean or cinematic. It was a fundamental collision between silent, structural competence and flashy, narrative-driven power. Graham possessed the supreme authority, the unquestioning backing of the board, and the charisma to make people believe his grand illusions. I possessed the structural blueprint to the building he was currently setting on fire. Whenever I challenged him, I did so quietly. I am a woman who never needs to raise her voice. In meetings, while the sycophants blindly praised his latest Velocity Lab concept, I would calmly outline the cash flow implications. "Graham," I would say, keeping my tone entirely neutral and my posture relaxed. "If we implement a full operational reset in the Missouri division today, we will need to pause the current integration of the regional fleet. That delay will cost us roughly $4 million in recognized synergies this quarter. How do you propose we bridge that massive gap for the debt covenant review next month?" He would smile, a tight, patronizing expression designed to disarm and immediately deflect. "Leah, you are focusing too much on the friction and not enough on the momentum. The financial architecture will naturally align with the visionary narrative once we establish the culture. It was always exactly like this." He treated my warnings as the pessimistic grumblings of a legacy executive who could not keep up with his soaring genius. He saw me as a gatekeeper of fear, an archaic obstacle to his grand design. He did not realize that I was not standing in his way. I was standing between him and a sheer, fatal drop. The tragedy of men like Graham is that they are entirely insulated from the immediate consequences of their own buzzwords. When a corporate strategy fails, they pivot. When a division collapses, they rebrand it. But logistics does not care about your personal brand or your agility. A missed shipment is a missed shipment. A defaulted loan is a defaulted loan. You cannot charm a spreadsheet, and you absolutely cannot talk a bank into ignoring a margin call. I watched him hollow out the company from the inside out, replacing seasoned operational directors with yes-men who eagerly spoke his new language. I watched the actual operational data begin to fracture and detach from the rosy projections he was feeding the board of directors. I knew exactly where the weak points were because I had meticulously mapped every single one of them. I had spent years building the safety mechanisms that kept Northspire breathing during its darkest hours. As I sat in that final quarterly review meeting, listening to him talk about my forced exit as a necessary strategic realignment, I felt a strange, chilling sense of peace. I did not feel the need to shout or scream or slam my fists against the table to defend my legacy. Real power does not require a megaphone. Real power is knowing the exact architectural load-bearing column of an empire and knowing exactly what happens when you quietly walk away and take the foundational supports with you. He had the title, the investors, and the vocabulary, but I had the keys to the engine. And as I gathered my things, I knew he was entirely unaware that he had just ordered the master mechanic to throw those keys directly into the fire. Following the third consecutive corporate buyout, North Spire Freight Systems did not function on standard enterprise software. Standard software is designed for stable companies, and we were a chimera of mismatched corporate cultures, incompatible ledgers, and bleeding supply chains. We survived solely because of an architectural web I had personally designed and coded into existence over 36 agonizing months. We called it the Helix Grid. If you asked any member of our board of directors what the Helix Grid was, they would recite the polished marketing language we put in our annual shareholder report. They would call it a strategic integration platform. They were completely wrong. In reality, the Helix Grid was the central nervous system of the entire corporation, a living, breathing digital organism that connected every major and minor decision made within our walls. It linked raw warehouse inventory data directly to real-time diesel fuel prices. It tied the profit margins of individual shipping routes across 20 different states to the rigid financial covenants dictated by our banking syndicate. It tracked the exact granular progress of post-merger integrations across 4 separate regional hubs. Every client quote generated by a sales representative in Dallas. Every bulk fuel purchase authorized in Memphis. Every line of credit extended to a regional subcontractor, and every single warehouse expansion plan had to pass through the invisible arteries of the grid before the final daily numbers could be locked. I did not build this colossal, intricate architecture because I possessed a tyrannical desire to control my colleagues. I built it out of sheer, terrifying necessity. During the 2 previous corporate acquisitions, the target companies had smiled, handed over their pristine financial statements, and lied through their teeth. They had systematically hidden toxic debt structures in offshore shell entities. They had aggressively doctored their inventory logs, counting phantom pallets of consumer goods to inflate their valuation before the ink on the merger documents was even dry. They dragged North Spire so dangerously close to breaching our master loan agreements that we were merely days away from total, unrecoverable liquidation. The grid was born from that specific, scorching trauma. It was a digital fortress designed to ensure that no one could ever lie to us from the inside again. Because of that history, I programmed a hard, fail-safe mechanism deep into the source code of the Helix Grid. It was a protocol that could not be bypassed by a simple password, a managerial override, or a charming email. Every Tuesday afternoon, exactly at 4 o'clock, the system compiled our aggregate covenant data, our cross-state inventory valuations, and our projected cash flow models. This was the exact, unvarnished data package required by our primary lenders and our largest institutional partners to prove we were solvent for the week. But before a single byte of that critical information could be transmitted out of our secure servers, the system hit a hard, impenetrable wall. It demanded an executive biometric attestation. It required a physical, cryptographic confirmation from the officially designated strategic authority. For years, without a single exception, that designated authority had always been me. The system demanded this extreme measure because cold numbers, no matter how efficiently gathered by automated software, fundamentally lack context. The grid would flag anomalies, but it took a human mind to understand the specific, ugly exceptions that made a balance sheet look beautiful but rendered it fundamentally false. I was the one who caught the double-counted freight, the lucrative goods that were marked as arriving in the Missouri hub, but were still technically sitting on a loading dock in Tennessee due to a union dispute. I was the one who identified the massive vendor rebates that ambitious department heads had prematurely booked as secured revenue when the final contracts were not even signed. I was the one who found the deeply unprofitable, bleeding trucking routes that regional managers were desperately trying to cross-subsidize with wildly optimistic future forecasts. I was the ultimate filter. I scrubbed the dirt off the data before the banks ever had a chance to see it and panic. Graham absolutely despised this mechanism. To him, the Tuesday afternoon attestation was an insulting bottleneck, a personal affront to his authority as the supreme executive. It is a legacy gatekeeper mentality, Graham told me during a particularly tense alignment meeting, his voice dripping with polished condescension as he adjusted his cuffs. We are operating at the speed of the modern market. Leah, we cannot have our primary financial data flow held hostage by a single individual demanding physical sign-offs. It lacks scalability. It lacks institutional trust. It is not a gatekeeper mentality, Graham, I replied, keeping my eyes fixed directly on his, refusing to give him an inch of rhetorical ground. It is an emergency brake. When you are driving a fully loaded freight truck down a steep mountain pass in the pitch dark, you do not complain that the brakes are slowing down your forward momentum. You pray they work when you inevitably hit a patch of black ice. He dismissed the analogy with a wave of his hand, completely unable to grasp the magnitude of the operational risk. We are not driving a truck. Leah, we are building a high-velocity enterprise. The Helix system is too rigid. It forces our divisional leaders to constantly look backward at compliance instead of looking forward at aggressive expansion. Those divisional leaders are trying to book unverified revenue to hit their quarterly bonuses, I countered, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Last week, the grid caught a $40 million discrepancy in the Georgia acquisition ledger. If that number had gone to the syndicate unverified, they would have frozen our short-term credit facility within 2 hours. Graham just smiled that practiced, empty smile. He viewed the grid as an annoying administrative hurdle, a piece of old, paranoid bureaucracy standing in the way of his aggressive growth narrative. He did not understand that the grid was the only thing preventing his fragile narrative from collapsing under the crushing weight of operational reality. The board of directors was equally oblivious, though their ignorance was born of comfort rather than arrogance. They suffered from the classic executive illusion because the system ran so smoothly month after month. They assumed the system was inherently simple to maintain. They saw the clean, error-free compliance reports delivered every Tuesday, and genuinely believed the integration of 3 massive companies was proceeding flawlessly by its own natural momentum. They never saw the constant, painstaking calibration that happened beneath the surface. They never saw the late hours I spent untangling contradictory ledgers from inherited legacy systems. They never heard the screaming matches I had with regional directors who tried to push unverified, phantom revenue through the corporate pipes to save their own jobs. Because they never felt the heat of the fire. They assumed the building was fireproof. They believed the machine was entirely self-sustaining. They had no idea that the machine only functioned because I was constantly, obsessively tuning the engine and tightening the bolts. This collective ignorance was the fatal structural flaw embedded in the new leadership dynamic. Graham was actively waging war against the very architecture that kept Northspire from violently breaking apart at the seams. He looked at the biometric lock on the Helix grid and saw a direct challenge to his absolute authority. He did not realize that the lock was not there to keep him out of the vault. It was there to keep the beast inside the vault from tearing the company to pieces. He was so desperate to prove his absolute control, so eager to impress the private equity backers with unchecked velocity, that he was entirely prepared to cut the invisible wires that held our fragile corporate empire together. He wanted to fly without a parachute, convinced that his own charisma and industry buzzwords would somehow alter the fundamental laws of financial gravity, and I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that gravity always wins. I just had to wait for him to take the final step off the ledge. The invasion began on a rainy Monday morning. Graham did not bring in seasoned turnaround executives or hardened logisticians to help run the empire. He brought in a boutique advisory firm named Vantage Ritual. They were a polished group of consultants who looked as though they had never handled a real operational crisis. These were individuals who possessed absolute zero practical knowledge of heavy supply chain mechanics. I would confidently wager my entire retirement portfolio that not a single partner at Vantage Ritual knew how to route a hazardous materials shipment through a Midwestern blizzard or how to negotiate a labor strike at a critical cross-docking facility. But what they lacked in operational literacy, they more than made up for in their terrifying ability to camouflage abject structural failure with agonizingly trendy corporate jargon. Almost overnight, the physical and intellectual space of my department was completely desecrated. The executive strategy room, where we used to sweat over route optimization and fuel hedging, was officially rebranded by the consultants as the Collaboration Studio. The massive, high-definition monitors that once displayed our real-time profit and loss heat maps across 90 separate distribution centers were unceremoniously stripped from the walls. In their place, the Vantage Ritual team hung up enormous pastel-colored canvases depicting our new brand energy palette. I watched in absolute cold disgust as our brutal vital key performance indicator meetings were politely renamed narrative calibration sessions. It was a corporate theater of the absurd, playing out while our actual freight trucks were literally burning through unhedged diesel fuel on the highways. This profound ridiculousness would have been somewhat tolerable if it were merely contained to interior design choices and pretentious meeting invitations. But Graham was aggressively driving the enterprise toward a massive debt refinancing round. He desperately wanted to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in new capital from the private equity markets, and to achieve that, he needed Northspire to look like a hyper-growth technology startup rather than a heavy-asset, deeply leveraged logistics firm. He started pushing wild, impossibly beautiful growth assumptions into the forward-looking financial models. I became the permanent, immovable roadblock in his path. During every single narrative calibration session, I sat at the table and demanded actual, hard evidence for his fantasies. "Graham," I said during one particularly painful Wednesday morning alignment meeting, leaning forward and resting my hands on the pristine wood table, "you absolutely cannot project a 35% increase in outbound volume for the upcoming third quarter when the physical warehouse integrations in Ohio and Pennsylvania are entirely stalled. We have physical inventory sitting in 2 separate states that currently does not reconcile with the master ledger. We are missing over $3 million in unaccounted freight, and you want to tell the banks we are expanding." The lead consultant from Vantage Ritual, a young man wearing a ridiculously expensive cashmere sweater draped casually over his shoulders, smiled at me with practiced condescension. "Leah, we think you are getting lost in day-to-day operational friction. The refinancing case is about scale, integration upside, and future market share. Macroscopic synergy does not pay for commercial diesel fuel," I snapped back, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "If you push these artificially inflated margin projections to the banking syndicate, and we miss our actual cash covenants by even a fraction of a percent, the banks will instantly trigger a massive default. I need to see the corresponding cash flow proofs and the attached risk matrices for every single theoretical projection you are injecting into this investor deck." Graham's jaw visibly tightened. The easy, charismatic smile melted right off his face. He stopped seeing me as a pessimistic, legacy annoyance and started viewing me as an active, existential threat to his grand corporate vision. I was the only person left in the C-suite who utterly refused to applaud his invisible clothes. I continuously demanded harsh reality in a room entirely intoxicated by expensive fiction. The absolute climax of this tragicomic farce arrived exactly 2 weeks later during the mandatory quarterly leadership review. The atmosphere in the flagship executive boardroom was thick with expensive cologne, nervous energy, and misplaced arrogance. Graham sat triumphantly at the head of the long oak table, flanked by his Vantage Ritual entourage. The rest of the senior vice presidents sat around the perimeter in eager deferential silence, terrified of being labeled as legacy thinkers. Graham stood up, projecting his voice with the perfectly rehearsed cadence of a Silicon Valley motivational speaker. He spent 45 agonizing minutes walking us through a slide deck that contained absolutely zero actionable operational data. It was an endless parade of ascending arrows, abstract geometric shapes, and meaningless buzzwords. Finally, he turned his focus directly onto me. The room instantly went dead silent. You could hear the low hum of the air conditioning unit. "To achieve this next evolutionary leap," Graham announced, looking at me with a cold, calculated stare designed to intimidate, "North Spire requires a fundamental shift in our executive DNA. We are entering a phase of exponential scaling. The modern market demands a growth storyteller to lead the charge. Unfortunately, some areas of our current leadership are still stubbornly operating as gatekeepers of fear. We simply cannot afford heavy anchors when we are trying to build a rocket ship." He was playing entirely to his captive audience, explicitly framing my demand for basic fiscal sanity as a toxic, outdated character flaw. The consultants nodded in solemn, sycophantic agreement. I did not flinch. I did not shift defensively in my leather executive chair. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the frustration burning in my chest. I looked right past the row of consultants and locked my eyes directly with Graham. "Let us be absolutely clear about what we are discussing right now," I said calmly, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second to ensure every single person in the room heard my words perfectly. "Do you want actual, sustainable growth? Or do you merely want the quarterly report to look like growth just long enough to fool the syndicate into approving the refinancing round?" The collective intake of breath around the table was sharp and audible. The chief financial officer suddenly found the grain of the wood on the table to be utterly fascinating, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The lead consultant from Vantage Ritual opened his mouth to intervene, but Graham held up a rigid hand to silence him. Graham did not answer the question. He could not answer it honestly without admitting fraud, and he could not deny it without looking incredibly weak. Instead, his handsome face hardened into a brutal mask of corporate finality. "Leah," he said, his voice dropping an octave, entirely devoid of any of its previous warmth, "your historical contributions to the legacy infrastructure of this enterprise have been noted and appreciated. However, effective immediately, you are being realigned out of the enterprise decision loop. Human Resources has already prepared your transition package. We wish you the absolute best in your future endeavors." It was the most sanitized, cowardly way a human being could possibly say you are fired. He was formally stripping me of all operational authority, permanently severing my access to the executive floor, and discarding me in front of the entire leadership team to make a very public example of what happens when you dare to challenge his narrative. I did not protest the decision. I did not demand a severance negotiation right there in the boardroom. I did not threaten legal action or beg for my position. I simply lowered my eyes to my left wrist. The silver hands on my analog watch indicated that it was exactly 3:42 in the afternoon. There were exactly 18 minutes left until 4 o'clock. 18 agonizingly short minutes until the Helix grid initiated its weekly uncompromising demand for a biometric executive attestation. 18 minutes until the central nervous system of the entire logistics empire reached out to find the officially designated strategic authority to validate the entire week's operational and financial data before releasing it to the unforgiving banking syndicate. By officially realigning me out of the enterprise decision loop, Graham had legally, technically, and permanently revoked my authorization to touch the system. He had just publicly fired the only human being on the face of the earth who possessed the clearance to keep the heart of the company beating. I looked up from my watch. The smug, self-congratulatory satisfaction painted across Graham's face was genuinely tragic to witness. The Vantage Ritual consultants were already whispering amongst themselves, likely drafting the glowing press release about my sudden departure. The air in the boardroom was thick with the victorious, intoxicating energy of a successful corporate coup. They all firmly believed they had just won the war. They thought they had successfully removed the annoying mechanic who kept telling them the brakes were failing. They had no earthly idea that the massive transport vehicle was already speeding toward a reinforced concrete wall at top speed, and they had just triumphantly thrown the only steering wheel out the window. The satirical, frustrating comedy of the past few weeks instantly evaporated from my mind, replaced entirely by a sharp, freezing, and absolute clarity. The atmosphere shifted from corporate theater to sheer, unadulterated terror. I calmly stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer, knowing full well what was about to happen. The silent countdown had already begun, and the invisible ticking in my head was absolutely deafening. I remained entirely silent as the echoes of his termination speech faded into the polished oak walls of the boardroom. I did not offer a desperate counter-argument. I did not plead for my tenure or the preservation of my legacy, nor did I threaten anyone with a wrongful termination lawsuit in front of the captive, sycophantic audience. I simply reached up to my lapel, unclipped my corporate identification badge, and placed it softly onto the pristine mahogany table. Next to it, I set down my company-issued mobile device. The screen was already dark, completely severed from my personal life. "I hope your advisory team understands the Helix better than I think they do," I said. My voice was perfectly level, carrying absolutely no trace of the adrenaline that was quietly, steadily flooding my veins. It was not a threat. It was a simple statement of terrifying fact. Graham offered a tight, patronizing smile. He clearly perceived my parting words as the hollow, bitter final shot of a defeated executive. He assumed I was merely grasping at the very last shreds of my professional dignity, trying to make him doubt a victory he had already secured. What he failed to comprehend was that I had just mentally confirmed a devastating reality. Not a single person sitting in that ridiculously expensive room had any concept of what the digital architecture was going to do in less than 20 minutes. I turned my back on the young chief executive officer and walked out of the room. The heavy glass door swung shut behind me with a soft, final click, cutting off the muffled sounds of the consultants already beginning to congratulate him on his bold leadership. The walk to the executive elevator felt strangely suspended in time. The thick, noise-canceling carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps, making the hallway feel like a vacuum. As the elevator doors slid closed, and the cab began its smooth descent toward the ground floor, a profound wave of physical exhaustion washed over me. I leaned my head against the cool steel wall and closed my eyes. The memories of the past few years flickered through my mind, not as a highlight reel of corporate victories, but as a grueling montage of sheer survival. I remembered the freezing nights I had spent sleeping on the hard floor of the strategy office during the chaotic aftermath of our expansion. I remembered the metallic taste of stale coffee at 3 a.m. as I manually rewrote the logic for our asset classification protocols, desperately patching the data leaks so the banking syndicate would not freeze our credit lines. I remembered the crushing weight of knowing that thousands of paychecks depended on my ability to keep the ledgers balanced against impossible odds. I had never coded a malicious time bomb into the company infrastructure. I am not a vindictive saboteur, and I do not operate on petty desires for personal revenge. I had simply constructed an extreme, uncompromising preventative system within an organization that possessed a terrifying addiction to expanding far faster than its ability to control its own limbs. The system was not designed to attack anyone. It was designed strictly to protect the core when the perimeter was compromised. By forcibly removing me from the equation without a transition protocol, Graham had just violently stripped away the perimeter. The elevator arrived at the ground floor lobby. I walked past the marble security desk, offering a polite nod to the guards, who did not yet know I no longer possessed the clearance to be in the building. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. Deep inside the climate-controlled server rooms on the 12th floor, the digital clock struck exactly 4:01 in the afternoon. The Helix grid executed its weekly uncompromising query. It reached out through the internal network, waiting for the designated strategic authority to provide the biometric executive attestation. It waited for my fingerprint and my encrypted security key to validate the week's margin data, to confirm our strict covenant compliance, and to authorize the transmission of our financial health to the outside world. It received absolutely nothing. For exactly 60 seconds, the system remained in a state of suspended inquiry, pinging the empty digital space for a response. Then, precisely at 2 minutes past the hour, the programmed safety protocols recognized a critical, fatal absence of command authority. The system did not crash. A crash implies a chaotic, unpredictable failure. The grid did something far more devastating. It executed a flawless, systematic lockdown. It instantly shifted into containment mode. The digital blast radius was immediate and absolute. The central architecture slammed the blast doors shut on the entire financial nervous system of the corporation. It instantly froze all margin certifications across every single regional division. It locked the pricing engines, completely preventing the generation of any new commercial quotes. It brutally paused all automated collateral updates scheduled to be sent out to the banking syndicate. Most importantly, it severed every single operational workflow that relied on uncertified strategic numbers. 3 minutes past the hour. On the 5th floor, the commercial sales department was abruptly thrown into a state of total chaos. Hundreds of account executives stared blankly at their monitors as glaring error messages populated their screens. They were in the middle of negotiating vital, multi-million-dollar freight contracts for the upcoming quarter, but the system flatly refused to finalize any route pricing. The underlying profit data was suspended, and the grid would not allow the company to sell a service if it could not mathematically guarantee that the service would not lose money. The sales floor erupted into a chorus of frantic phone calls to the Information Technology Help Desk, completely unaware that the technology was functioning exactly as it was instructed. Simultaneously, on the 9th floor, the Treasury Department watched in mounting horror as their financial dashboards automatically refreshed. The short-term credit limits, the very lifeblood that allowed the company to operate day to day, were suddenly flagged with a severe warning marking them as review pending. The automated bridge loans that covered upcoming payroll and vendor payments were halted dead in their tracks because the grid refused to confirm our asset collateral. The screens turned a dull, unresponsive gray. Down in the procurement division, the fuel purchasing team frantically mashed their keyboards. They were attempting to lock in millions of dollars in overnight diesel orders to keep the massive transport fleet moving the next morning. The system denied their requests. The procurement engine could not authorize massive capital expenditures when the overarching cash flow projections lacked the required executive signature. Their purchasing authority had been digitally revoked. By 10 minutes past the hour, the digital paralysis reached the physical ground level. The regional dispatch centers, spread across 4 different states, suddenly lost their ability to make critical decisions. The complex optimization system that told them which trucks to load, which warehouses to empty, and which routes to prioritize abruptly dropped into a rigid, impenetrable safe mode. The algorithms refused to clear any transport vehicle for departure if the attached freight carried an unconfirmed profit margin. Hundreds of heavy transport trucks sat idling in the dispatch yards, fully loaded with perishable goods and time-sensitive materials, but lacking the digital authorization to move past the security gates. The local operators shouted into their radios, completely blind to the fact that the corporate command center was digitally deaf. The entire supply chain had been placed in a digital chokehold. I walked across the sprawling, sun-baked asphalt of the employee parking lot. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows from the glass and steel structure behind me. I reached my old, reliable sport utility vehicle and unlocked the door. Before my hand even pulled the handle, my personal mobile phone, sitting deep inside my leather tote bag, began to vibrate. It buzzed with a frantic, continuous, desperate rhythm. It was a chaotic symphony of incoming text messages, panicked voicemails, and emergency alerts from the few trusted colleagues who still had my private number. I did not reach into the bag to answer it. I did not need to look at the illuminated screen to know exactly what was happening up there. I slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather familiar and comforting against my back. I inserted the key into the ignition and started the engine. I adjusted the rear-view mirror, catching a final glimpse of the towering corporate headquarters reflecting the late afternoon light. It looked incredibly sturdy and entirely impenetrable from the outside, but I knew the absolute truth. The magnificent glass tower behind my back had just begun to collapse in on itself. A corporate empire does not die in a single, Cinematic explosion. It dies exactly like a massive biological organism experiencing rapid systemic shock. It suffocates silently, organ by organ, bleeding out through 1,000 severed veins. The first major casualty occurred exactly 15 minutes after I walked out of the building. Down in Nashville, our largest regional automotive parts client was waiting on a critical, massive contract renewal. This was a deal meant to secure thousands of dedicated freight runs over the next 36 months. The regional sales director had the final proposal ready on his screen, but when he attempted to generate the binding document, the pricing engine flatly refused to execute the command. The system was programmed to never lock in a long-term rate without a certified, up-to-the-minute verification of our regional fuel margins. Because that margin data was now frozen in the containment protocol, the engine balked. It threw a hard error, leaving our largest southern client staring at an empty inbox while their own supply chain deadlines rapidly expired. 5 minutes later, the crisis leaped from the sales floor to the high-stakes world of institutional finance. Every afternoon, our automated treasury bridge sent a massive, encrypted packet of covenant data to our revolving credit syndicate on Wall Street. It was the digital heartbeat that proved we were solvent enough to borrow money for the next 24 hours. But the grid stripped the unverified profit margins out of the transmission. The banking algorithm received a hollow file. It took less than 10 seconds for the syndicate's automated risk management software to flag North Spire Freight Systems as an unquantifiable liability. The bank immediately shifted our profile to a severe risk review status, instantly freezing a significant portion of our daily borrowing room. In the fragile, hyper-connected world of corporate finance, a frozen credit line is the equivalent of a loud gunshot in a crowded theater. It is more than enough to trigger a market panic. The panic spread outward immediately. Two of our primary commercial diesel suppliers, massive energy conglomerates that monitored the same financial risk channels, detected the sudden credit freeze. They did not hesitate. They instantly revoked our overnight preferential pricing orders. If our trucks needed to fill their tanks at dawn, we would no longer be paying the aggressively negotiated wholesale rate. We would be paying the punishing, fluctuating spot market price. In the span of a single afternoon, the operating costs for a fleet of over 4,000 vehicles skyrocketed by tens of thousands of dollars per hour. Up on the executive floor, the investor relations department was simultaneously walking into a concrete wall. They were frantically attempting to finalize the quarterly data tables that Graham had promised to deliver to the board of directors and our primary private equity investors by 5 o'clock. The team clicked the export command, expecting a beautifully formatted spreadsheet of ascending revenues. Instead, the grid blocked the export entirely, stamping a massive red digital watermark across the screen. The system had identified a specific cluster of post-merger synergy assumptions and flagged them with a brutal, uncompromising label unsupported variance. The numbers were entirely mathematically baseless, and the system absolutely refused to let the company lie to its own investors. I knew the exact sequence of events unfolding because I had written the operational rules that governed them. I could vividly picture the absolute chaos engulfing the C-suite. Graham would have immediately summoned his new leadership team and the boutique consultants into the glass-walled war room. He would have demanded a manual override. The tragedy of men who rely entirely on their own charisma is that they believe technology will eventually yield to their authority if they simply shout loud enough. He would have ordered the chief information officer to bypass the security protocols, to forcefully push the frozen numbers through the pipes by manually editing the source code. This was the deadliest trap of the entire architecture. The harder they tried to force the system, the deeper the teeth sank into the bone. Years ago, during a particularly vicious internal audit, I had specifically designed an anti-tampering mechanism to prevent rogue executives from cooking the books. When the grid detected a manual, brute force override attempt on raw data that did not perfectly match the verified origin ledgers, it did not just block the action, it actively escalated the containment level. It assumed the network was under a hostile internal attack. As Graham's terrified engineers desperately tried to punch through the digital bulkheads, The grid responded by locking down even tighter, severing secondary access points and isolating the core databases entirely. Inside that war room, the atmosphere would be thick with pure, unadulterated panic. The department heads would be screaming over each other, desperately trying to explain that the sales pipeline, the credit facilities, the freight rates, and the cash flow models were all tangled in the exact same immovable knot. And sitting amidst the burning wreckage of the operational structure, the consultants from Vantage Ritual would be entirely useless. They did not know how to code, they did not know how to route a truck, and they could not charm a server into compliance. Their only advice would be to spin the narrative, to draft a preemptive press release blaming a temporary server migration issue. You cannot spin a narrative when the bank is refusing to clear your payroll checks. But the true brilliance of the containment mode was not just its ability to stop the bleeding, it was its mandate to expose the cause of the wound. At exactly 45 minutes past the hour, the system executed its final diagnostic protocol. When the grid drops into an extreme lockdown, it is programmed to project a highly visible, unalterable log onto the primary internal dashboards. The purpose is to show the auditing teams exactly which conflicting data points triggered the emergency brake. Suddenly, every active monitor in the executive war room and every screen in the internal auditing department flashed with lines of raw, undeniable truth. The grid peeled back the layers of Graham's beautiful soaring growth charts and displayed the underlying source files. Right there, in high-contrast text, the system revealed that a critical chain of revenue forecasts had been manually altered. It showed that the numbers had not just been tweaked once, but actively manipulated 3 separate times over the past 7 days. It displayed the exact timestamps of the edits, the specific user credentials of the executives who made them, and the massive, glaring delta between the actual, miserable ground-level data and the fictional, inflated numbers Graham was trying to sell to Wall Street. The digital masks were violently ripped away. The polished language, the velocity labs, the story-led leadership nonsense were entirely stripped bare, revealing nothing but a desperate, fraudulent attempt to artificially inflate the valuation of a struggling company. The shutdown was no longer just a terrifying demonstration of what happens when a vital system loses its master architect. It had transformed into a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. The grid had not merely stopped the company from moving forward. It was actively broadcasting the exact lies that had driven them to the edge of the cliff. The silence in that war room must have been absolute, heavy with the sudden, crushing realization that their own aggressive ambition had just been broadcast as a confession they could not erase. I did not drive to my house. Returning to my empty suburban driveway meant accepting defeat and retreating into isolation, and I had absolutely no intention of retreating. I merged onto the southbound interstate and drove for exactly 14 miles until I reached a faded, neon-lit steakhouse sitting just off the highway exit. It was a worn, unpretentious establishment with cracked vinyl seating and dim lighting. The kind of place where exhausted cross-country freight drivers and off-shift warehouse managers ate heavy meals in absolute silence. It was the perfect tactical sanctuary. I slid into a booth in the far back corner, ordered a glass of iced water and a rare cut of beef, and placed my personal mobile phone face up on the sticky wooden table. I knew someone from the inside would eventually break protocol and reach out. The only question was who would be desperate enough to crack first. At exactly 6:15 in the evening, the screen illuminated. The caller identification displayed the name Naomi Reddick. Naomi was our former director of internal audit, a woman with a terrifying eye for discrepancies. A month prior, Graham had politely reorganized her into a meaningless advisory role, effectively stripping her of her authority because she asked too many difficult questions about his aggressive accounting methods. "Leah," Naomi said, her voice dropping to an urgent, frantic whisper. I could hear the faint echo of tiles in the background. She was clearly hiding in a restroom stall to make the call. "The entire building is tearing itself apart. The executive floor looks like a war zone, but that is not why I am calling you." "Tell me what you see on your end, Naomi," I replied, taking a slow, measured sip of my water. The containment mode triggered an automated server dump, she explained, her words rushing out in a breathless torrent. When the main system locked the financial architecture down, the failsafe protocol automatically unsealed the restricted internal auditing logs. It gave my department read-only access to a vault of files that Graham explicitly firewalled from us last week. Leah, the quarterly forecasts are completely fabricated. I am staring at the raw ledgers right now on my tablet. Someone went in and artificially inflated the projected regional freight volumes for the next 3 quarters by over 40%. They are aggressively dressing up the balance sheet for the refinancing round, and they are using entirely ghost numbers to do it. Before I could fully process the sheer audacity of the fraud. The other line beeped. It was Dexter Boone, the Senior Director of Treasury. Dexter was a corporate survivalist. He had never once publicly defended me in the boardroom because he preferred to stay safely camouflaged in the middle of the executive herd. But Dexter was fundamentally a numbers man, and numbers men know exactly when the mathematics become fatal. I put Naomi on a brief hold and clicked over to the new line. Hello. Dexter. Leah, you have to tell me how to unfreeze the short-term bridge loans, Dexter pleaded, his breathing shallow and rapid, bordering on hyperventilation. The banking syndicate just issued a formal notice of critical review. If the Treasury accounts do not unlock tonight, we are going to miss the entire vendor payment cycle tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. The market will crucify us. I cannot help you. Dexter, I am no longer an authorized employee of North Spire, I stated smoothly, showing absolutely zero sympathy. Besides, why is the syndicate panicking so quickly? The underlying cash flow should be robust enough to weather a brief, temporary system outage. Because the underlying cash flow is not robust, Dexter confessed, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated terror. Graham forced my team to pre-sign internal memos validating the synergy realizations from the last 3 acquisitions. We authorized official documents stating those target companies were fully integrated and generating $20 million in combined operational savings. But you and I both know those integrations are a complete disaster. We are bleeding cash in the Ohio hubs. If the banks look closely at the halted data packets, they will see that the synergy memos are completely unsupported by the actual, physical revenue. We lied to them. Leah. I merged the 2 calls, seamlessly connecting Naomi and Dexter on the same secure line. I did not gloat. I did not waste time reminding them that I had warned the entire leadership team about this exact scenario. I simply leaned back against the cracked vinyl of the restaurant booth and began to stitch the ugly, sprawling tapestry together in my mind. Graham was not merely an arrogant, incompetent executive blinded by his own modern business vocabulary. That would have been dangerous, but ultimately predictable. This was something entirely different. He was executing a highly calculated, desperate financial maneuver. He was trying to shove the entire logistics empire through a massive, $500 million refinancing window using a completely fictitious growth narrative. He desperately needed that massive cash injection to cover up the severe bleeding from his failed integrations before the board of directors noticed the rotting floorboards beneath their feet. There is something else, Leah, Naomi interjected, her tone shifting from anxious to deeply, profoundly cynical. While I was digging through the unsealed procurement logs, I found a vendor proposal sitting in a draft folder, waiting for final executive approval. It is from a software development firm heavily affiliated with Vantage Ritual. The consulting group, I sat up straight, the ambient noise of the steakhouse fading away completely. Read the details to me. Every word. It is a preliminary master service agreement, Naomi read, her voice tight with suppressed anger, for the design and implementation of a next-generation, agile enterprise resource platform. The proposed contract value is $18 million, with an additional $5 million in annual maintenance fees. It was drafted 2 weeks ago. The final heavy curtain fell away, exposing the entire mechanical structure of the stage. The crisis currently paralyzing the company was not an accident. My sudden termination was not merely a clash of personalities or a philosophical disagreement over strategic direction. It was a deliberate, incredibly lucrative conspiracy. Graham and the Vantage Ritual consultants knew my architectural safety nets would eventually expose their fraudulent refinancing numbers. The grid was too strict, too honest, and completely immune to their corporate storytelling. So, they engineered a situation to kill two birds with a single stone. They decided to publicly fire the architect, knowing with absolute certainty it would trigger a massive systemic failure. They intended to let the company grind to a terrifying, highly visible halt. Then, in the midst of the engineered panic, they would step forward and declare my legacy system catastrophically unstable and dangerously obsolete. They would use the very crisis they intentionally created to justify awarding an $18 million no-bid contract to their own affiliated partners to build a brand new, compliant system. A system that would conveniently lack the rigorous, uncompromising safety constraints I had built. They were setting the company up to fail from the inside, planning to profit from the wreckage of the infrastructure they were actively sabotaging. "Dexter," I said, my voice cutting through the static of the phone line like a cold steel scalpel. "If I walk back into that building tonight and unlock the system, what happens tomorrow morning?" Dexter hesitated, the reality of brutal corporate politics weighing heavily on his tongue. Graham survives the night. The bank syndicate sees the locked numbers finally flow through. The panic subsides, and the massive refinancing round continues based on the manipulated forecasts. "And what exactly happens to me?" I asked, though I already knew the precise answer. "Graham will draft an emergency memorandum to the board of directors," Naomi answered quietly, understanding the trap perfectly. "He will frame the entire shutdown as a malicious act of sabotage by a disgruntled, vindictive former employee. He will argue that you built a dangerous single point of failure that nearly bankrupted the enterprise. They will use the board's panic to immediately authorize the Vantage Ritual software contract, and they will absolutely file civil charges against you to cover their own tracks." I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the smell of roasted meat and cheap industrial floor cleaner. If I rushed in right now to play the loyal hero, I would be handing my own head to the executioner on a silver platter. I would be fixing the engine just so the thieves could drive the truck off the cliff, only to have them blame the mechanic for the inevitable crash. I could not simply save the company tonight. Saving the company right now meant saving the parasites actively feeding on its lifeblood. I had to let the fever burn hot enough to break the infection entirely. I had to let the sheltered board of directors feel the absolute, terrifying heat of the fire, so they would be forced to look very closely at who exactly was holding the matches. "Listen to me very carefully," I instructed, speaking to both of them with the cold, absolute authority I used when tearing down a hostile acquisition. "Do not attempt to assist the engineering team. Do not help them bypass the security protocols. Let them keep hitting the concrete wall. Leah, if this lockdown continues until tomorrow morning, the stock price will crater," Dexter warned, his voice trembling at the prospect of financial ruin. "Let it crater," I replied without a single ounce of hesitation. "A temporary dip in market valuation is the necessary price of a surgical extraction. Naomi, I need you to quietly copy every single draft, every manipulated forecast, and every piece of that Vantage Ritual proposal onto an encrypted external drive. Dexter, I need you to go into your office and physically gather the synergy memos Graham forced you to sign. Put them in a briefcase. Do not leave the building. Do not speak a single word to the consultants. Just gather the ammunition and wait in the shadows." I disconnected the call and placed the phone back onto the table. The waitress arrived, placing a hot, sizzling plate of food in front of me. I picked up my knife and fork, feeling a strange, profound sense of calm wash over me. I was no longer playing defense against a reckless young executive. I was preparing to dismantle a coordinated financial assault, and to do that successfully. I had to be patient enough to let the steel trap close entirely around them before I tightened the noose. I knew exactly what Graham was orchestrating while the servers aggressively locked him out of his own empire. He was not trying to fix the paralyzed logistics network. He was desperately trying to fix the blame. I could vividly picture him pacing the plush carpets of the executive floor, ordering the General Counsel to immediately draft a preemptive internal memorandum. They would be meticulously choosing their vocabulary, utilizing phrases like irresponsibly centralized architecture and dangerously dependent on a single point of failure. They were hurriedly constructing a polished legal narrative designed to frame me as a rogue, paranoid architect who had selfishly monopolized the corporate infrastructure. If that fabricated memorandum reached the board of directors before the actual raw data did, the truth would be permanently buried beneath a massive avalanche of corporate legalese. I did not rush back to the headquarters to play the noble savior. Stepping into the glass tower right then would have been walking directly into their carefully prepared, brightly lit trap. Instead, I remained in the dimly lit corner of the highway steakhouse and turned my mobile phone into a silent command center. I sent secure, encrypted messages to Naomi and Dexter, refusing to let them succumb to the mounting panic. Do not simply download the raw containment logs, I instructed Naomi, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard. Find every single email thread where the internal audit team explicitly raised concerns about the new valuation metrics over the past 3 months. More importantly, find the exact timestamps where Graham or his designated proxies systematically dismissed those warnings in writing. To Dexter, I delivered a similarly precise directive. Gather the earliest drafts of the refinancing presentations. Locate the specific versions from before the Vantage Ritual consultants injected their artificially inflated projections. Package those original documents alongside the forced synergy memos he made your Treasury team sign last week. We need the entire paper trail. I needed an airtight, chronological fortress of evidence proving that the catastrophic failure currently rippling through our supply chain was not a mysterious bug in the software, but a direct, inevitable result of willful executive negligence. With the necessary ammunition quietly gathering in the digital shadows, I took a deep breath and made the one phone call I had been actively dreading for half a year. I dialed the private, unlisted number of Marlene Wexler. The legendary founder of Northspire Freight Systems was currently residing in a secluded estate in Santa Fe, undergoing a quiet, grueling physical recovery from her latest cardiac procedure. I had spent the last 6 months actively shielding her from the daily absurdities and the toxic culture shifts of Graham's leadership. I had done so because her health was genuinely fragile, and my own professional pride convinced me I could manage the internal bleeding on my own. I was entirely wrong, and the time for stoic silence had completely expired. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice raspy but immediately alert. Leah, I assume you are not calling me at 7 o'clock in the evening to discuss the beauty of the desert sunset. I am no longer an employee of Northspire, I told her, delivering the information without a single trace of emotion. Graham formally fired me at 3:42 this afternoon, at exactly 4 o'clock. The entire strategic architecture went into maximum containment mode. The corporate network is currently paralyzed. For a long, heavy moment, there was only the sound of her measured breathing echoing over the cellular connection. When she finally spoke, her tone was thick with profound disbelief. Graham is extraordinarily arrogant, Leah, but he is not fundamentally suicidal. Why in the world would he blindly cut the wire on the very system that is currently keeping the bank syndicate at bay? Because the system absolutely refused to lie to the banking syndicate for him, I replied. I did not waste precious time with emotional complaints or defensive posturing. I opened my encrypted email application and forwarded the primary investigative dossier that Naomi had just finished compiling. Check your secure inbox right now. Marlene, I just sent you the original, factual quarterly forecast sitting directly alongside the artificially inflated numbers Graham attempted to push through the network this afternoon. And right beneath those ledgers, you will find an unapproved master service agreement for $18 million. It was drafted by a software firm directly tied to his new consulting team. They were preparing to completely replace my infrastructure with their own, the absolute second the board gave them an excuse. I heard the faint, distinct clicking of a computer mouse as Marlene opened the attached files on her end. The silence stretched out, growing colder and more absolute with every passing second. I could almost feel the temperature dropping through the phone line. When she finally spoke again, The physical frailty in her voice had completely vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, cold steel that had built a logistics empire out of nothing but dirt roads and determination. "He thinks he found a brilliant legal loophole," Marlene stated, her words dropping like heavy iron weights. When I stepped down and handed the chief executive title over to him, I forced the private equity partners to sign a highly specific, binding transition resolution. I explicitly embedded a governance covenant stating that the core RAS risk control systems you personally designed could absolutely not be decommissioned or fundamentally altered without a formal two-thirds majority vote from the board of directors. I sat perfectly still in the cracked vinyl booth, entirely absorbing the massive magnitude of what she had just revealed. I had never been informed about that specific contractual clause. He knew he could never get the board of directors to vote against the risk controls if things were running smoothly, Marlene continued, her voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal fury. So, he decided to bypass the governance framework entirely by terminating the only human being authorized to validate the system. He thought he could manufacture a catastrophic system failure, blame the old architecture for the crisis, and force our hand in a state of absolute panic. The scattered pieces on the board suddenly locked into a brilliant, unassailable formation. I was not just a wronged executive fighting a bitter retaliatory battle for my reputation. I possessed the absolute legal and moral high ground. I was the only person in the entire corporate hierarchy who was actually defending the foundational governance framework that the company itself had legally mandated. I was not the architect of a malicious sabotage. I was the last remaining guard standing within the approved parameters. "I am officially calling an emergency session of the Board of Directors," Marlene announced, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Tonight, exactly at 8:30, I will have the corporate secretary initiate the secure video bridge. I want you on that call. Leah." "I will attend," I said, my voice entirely steady and completely devoid of hesitation. "But I have 3 non-negotiable conditions before I log in. First, the entire emergency session must be formally recorded and transcribed word for word into the permanent corporate minutes. Second, every single outside consultant, including the entire Vantage Ritual team, must be physically barred from the room and completely disconnected from the bridge. This is an internal governance crisis, and they possess zero legal standing to be present or to hear the proceedings." "Agreed," Marlene snapped sharply. "And the third condition, Graham must be forced to present his refinancing forecasts directly to the board, entirely on the record, before I say a single word. He must answer for the manipulated data before he is allowed to present his memorandum blaming the system architecture." "Consider it done," Marlene promised, and abruptly severed the connection. I placed the phone face down next to my empty water glass. Outside the dusty window of the steakhouse, the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, signaling the arrival of a very long night. I had the technical power to instantly unlock the network right from my table, to free the frozen credit lines, and to get the massive fleet of trucks moving across the country before midnight. But a master chess player does not loudly capture the king the very second he is exposed on the board. You patiently position your final pieces in total silence, methodically cutting off every single possible avenue of escape. You ensure that when the final, devastating move is made, the opponent realizes they had utterly defeated themselves long before you ever touched the board. I signaled the exhausted waitress for the check. It was time to go before the board. The secure video bridge connected exactly at 8:30 in the evening. I sat in the driver's seat of my parked vehicle, the engine turned off, relying only on the faint, cold glow of my laptop screen illuminating the dark cabin. When the grid of faces populated on my monitor, the contrast was incredibly stark. The board members were dialing in from various opulent home offices across the country, their expressions a mixture of severe exhaustion and rising panic. In the center tile, sitting completely alone at the head of the massive corporate boardroom table, was Graham. Marlene had enforced my condition. The expensive consultants were entirely banished from the room. Graham immediately attempted to seize control of the narrative, projecting his signature polished confidence, though I could see a faint sheen of sweat reflecting under the harsh, recessed lighting. "Members of the board," Graham began, keeping his vocal cadence smooth and reassuring. "We are currently navigating a highly unfortunate but entirely temporary technical friction. What we are experiencing tonight is not a structural failure of our business model. It is the catastrophic failure of a legacy architecture. Leah constructed a system that is fundamentally unfit for a modern enterprise. It is a rigid, archaic structure designed around a single point of failure. When we attempted to transition her out of the decision loop to modernize our operations, the system maliciously locked the entire company out. This is a painful but necessary extraction of outdated technology." He paused, waiting for the familiar nods of agreement that usually followed his corporate storytelling. He received absolute, terrifying silence. "Are you quite finished with the narrative calibration, Graham?" I asked, my voice cut through the laptop speakers, completely devoid of heat or anger. "Because we do not have time for modern enterprise theories while the commercial fleet is grounded." I did not wait for his permission. I addressed the corporate secretary, who was managing the digital bridge. "Please mirror my screen to the main session." Within 2 seconds, the faces on the grid shrank, replaced by a dense, high-contrast readout of the Helix containment logs. "I am not going to debate software philosophy," I stated smoothly. "I am going to show you exactly why the system executed an emergency brake. Look at line 412. At exactly 2:15 on Thursday afternoon, a manual override was forced into the primary forecasting module. Someone intentionally erased the actual projected losses for the Ohio logistics hub and replaced them with a fabricated 22% volume increase." Graham stiffened. "Leah, those were highly adjusted forward-looking models based on anticipated velocity." "They were lies," I interrupted, my tone slicing through his defense like a razor. "And I can prove exactly who ordered them. Look at the approval credential on the right side of the screen. The executive sign-off belongs to your office, Graham. You bypassed the automated risk warnings and manually forced the numbers higher." Before he could attempt another deflection, another voice joined the audio channel. It was Naomi. "I can verify that timeline," Naomi stated firmly from her own video tile. 3 weeks ago, my internal audit team flagged a severe covenant risk regarding those exact Ohio figures. I drafted a formal memorandum warning that we were mathematically incapable of meeting the bank requirements if we relied on those hubs. I delivered it directly to the chief executive. His office buried the report, claiming my data did not fit the growth narrative for this quarter. The faces of the board members began to shift from confusion to a cold, dawning horror. "It goes deeper than the forecasts," Dexter added, his voice trembling slightly but holding its ground. The director of Treasury looked exhausted, staring directly into his camera. "Last Wednesday, Graham called me into a closed-door meeting. He aggressively pressured me to sign a series of official Treasury memos validating massive synergy realizations from the recent acquisitions. He needed those signatures to finalize the refinancing dossier for the banking syndicate. I told him we had not achieved even 10% of those operational savings. He told me he had the full backing of the board to push the assumptions forward. I signed them under extreme duress because I believed I was executing a board-approved strategy." An audible gasp echoed over the digital bridge from one of the senior board directors. They had never backed any such strategy. They had been kept entirely in the dark. Marlene Wexler unmuted her microphone. Her face was pale from her illness, but her eyes possessed the lethal sharpness of a hunting hawk. "Let us abandon the pretense of technical glitches," Marlene commanded, her voice vibrating with authority. "Graham, I want you to look directly into the camera and answer a very simple question. Why did a software company directly affiliated with your new Vantage Ritual Consulting Group prepare an $18 million proposal to replace the Helix system just days after you isolated our chief strategy officer from the executive loop?" The question hit the virtual room like a physical shockwave. Graham physically recoiled in his leather chair, the polished veneer completely shattered. He looked frantically at the camera, then at his empty boardroom. suddenly realizing the sheer depth of the trap he was standing in. That proposal was merely an exploratory benchmarking exercise, Graham stammered, his perfect enunciation completely disintegrating into rapid defensive panic. We have to move at the speed of the market. The operational teams were facing massive resistance to change. Leah was creating a toxic culture of compliance over growth. I had to build a parallel strategy to ensure the enterprise could scale. You did not build a parallel strategy, Marlene countered coldly. You built a parallel reality. And you were perfectly willing to let this entire company crash into a wall just so your friends could get paid to sweep up the glass. Graham ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, desperately searching for a final lifeline. Even if the projections were aggressive, Leah had absolutely no right to build a system that takes the entire company hostage. She designed a dictatorial kill switch. When she left, the system intentionally destroyed the evidence of our momentum. That is corporate sabotage. That was the exact moment I played the final, devastating card. The system did not destroy anything, Graham, I said softly, leaning closer to the microphone. And it did not just lock the doors to punish you. When I built the architectural safeguards years ago, I knew that a truly desperate executive might try to eliminate the safety inspector rather than fix the broken machinery. So, I wrote a very specific contingency protocol. We called it the executive removal anomaly. I tapped a single key on my laptop. The screen shared to the board shifted from the raw logs to a secure, time-stamped delivery receipt. Exactly 3 seconds before the system went into total containment mode this afternoon, it recognized that the authorized strategic executive had been forcibly removed without a proper handover sequence, I explained, letting the absolute finality of the trap settle over the board. The grid was programmed to assume the company was under a hostile internal takeover. It did not just freeze the operations, it executed a massive, immutable data dump. It automatically packaged every single original ledger, every single overridden warning, and every piece of altered data, and blind copied the entire uncorrupted history directly to the secure servers of the board's external auditing firm. You cannot rewrite history, Graham, because the system had already mailed the original manuscript to the auditors before you even fired me. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The board of directors finally understood the terrifying, undeniable truth. The infrastructure that Graham had repeatedly mocked as a dictatorial legacy system was not a weapon designed to hurt them. It was the final, unbreakable safety harness that had just caught them milliseconds before they plummeted into a fatal financial abyss. Fully painted with the beautiful, empty buzzwords of a modern visionary, Graham sat entirely paralyzed in the massive, empty boardroom, his mouth slightly open, devoid of any further storytelling. He had tried to stage a brilliant, highly profitable corporate takedown, only to realize he had locked himself into the very downfall he designed. At last, the silence on the video bridge was broken. The chairman of the board, a man whose private portfolio was heavily overleveraged in our logistics empire, leaned into his camera. He did not possess his usual commanding, aristocratic baritone. His voice was thin, reedy, and laced with absolute desperation. Leah, we understand the immense gravity of this situation. We hear you, and we recognize the massive oversight, the chairman pleaded, attempting to project a sense of unified authority that no longer existed. But the immediate existential priority is survival. The banking syndicate is going to formally lock our operating accounts at midnight. We need you to drive back to the headquarters right now, log into the secure server room, and restore the operational grid. We can discuss your executive compensation, your title, and the internal restructuring tomorrow morning when the bleeding has stopped. I looked at the digital mosaic of terrified billionaires on my laptop screen and shook my head slowly. I sat perfectly still in the dark cabin of my vehicle, insulated from their panic. I am not driving back to the office to act as a midnight plumber for a burning house that someone else intentionally doused in gasoline, I replied. My voice was stripped of any remaining corporate politeness. I was no longer playing the defensive role of the misunderstood architect. Tonight is not about scheduling emergency maintenance. And it is certainly not about negotiating a modest salary bump. It is about who actually owns the structural reality of this enterprise. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring that every single syllable landed with maximum impact. I am not returning as the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy. If I step back into that building, I return as the Chief Strategy and Resilience Officer. And that new title comes with an explicit, legally binding veto power. Moving forward, no executive, no outside consultant, and no member of this board will possess the authority to alter, bypass, or decommission any core risk control mechanism without my direct, written authorization. The chairman immediately started to protest, his hands fluttering nervously. Leah, giving a single officer absolute, unchecked veto power over our enterprise systems, is the exact reason the company is not currently in receivership. I cut him off smoothly, leaving absolutely no room for debate. My second condition involves the collateral damage of Graham's fictional storytelling. Naomi Reddick and Dexter Boone are to be fully restored to their original operational capacities immediately. Furthermore, the two senior directors of post-merger integration and the head of data analytics, all of whom were systematically demoted or marginalized over the past 3 months for refusing to manipulate their ledgers, will be reinstated by tomorrow morning. Every single one of them will receive a formal, board-certified letter of exoneration. I did not give them a single moment to breathe or formulate a counteroffer. The momentum belonged entirely to me. Through, I continued, staring directly at Graham's digital square. The contract with Vantage Ritual is terminated effective immediately. Every single consultant is to be escorted out of the building by corporate security before I walk through the front doors. Any proposal to replace the architectural network is permanently frozen pending a completely independent, third-party forensic audit of the executive communications. On the center tile, Graham looked as though all the blood had been violently drained from his body. His immaculate posture had collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one final, desperate defense of his visionary leadership, but no words materialized. The charismatic storyteller had finally run out of stories. And as for the chief executive, I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal calm, Graham is to be entirely stripped of all executive authority regarding financial operations, integration strategy, corporate credit facilities, and enterprise systems. He will not approve a single expenditure, he will not sign a single vendor contract, and he will not dictate a single operational directive. Pending a full internal investigation into the fraudulent refinancing dossier, the board members exchanged panicked, silent glances across their respective video feeds. They were being explicitly asked to strip their hand-picked visionary leader of power and hand the operational keys over to the exact woman they had allowed him to publicly fire just hours ago. Before the chairman could attempt to negotiate a softer compromise or propose a transitional committee, Marlene Wexler's voice echoed over the audio bridge. Leah's terms are entirely sufficient for operational recovery, Marlene announced, her tone sharp and uncompromising, but they are entirely insufficient for her personal risk. The board allowed a rogue executive to bypass a legally binding governance resolution and terminate the one person holding our entire debt structure together. That is a profound, catastrophic failure of oversight. Marlene paused, letting the harsh sting of her reprimand sink deep into the egos of the men on the screen. If Leah is going to step back into the fire to save this syndicate from a massive, fatal default, she will not do so as a highly compensated employee who can be sacrificed the next time the market wind changes. She will be granted a substantial, fully vested equity package. She will receive an ownership stake large enough to guarantee that she is permanently entrenched at the highest level of this corporation. She will never again be an easily discarded liability. The standoff that followed was agonizing for the board of directors. Accepting this comprehensive package meant formally, legally admitting that they had been utterly deceived by a charismatic fraud. It meant confessing on paper that their collective judgment had nearly driven a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire straight into the ground in pursuit of a flashy narrative. Stripping Graham of his power and elevating me to an untouchable, equity holding position was a brutal, public humiliation. I watched the chairman mute his microphone for a long, agonizing period. I knew he was rapidly messaging the other directors on a separate, secure back channel. They were desperately searching for a third option, a magic legal loophole that would allow them to save face while simultaneously saving their massive financial investments. But the walls were rapidly closing in. I glanced at the digital clock on my vehicle dashboard. It was approaching 9:15 in the evening. The spot market for commercial diesel opens in less than 8 hours, I reminded them softly, breaking the digital silence and forcing them back to reality. The banking syndicate will formally lock the short-term credit facilities exactly at midnight. If the routing engines remain paralyzed past 2 o'clock in the morning freight will not load. The regional dispatch centers will effectively cease to exist, and the Asian shipping partners will wake up to frozen letters of credit. I stared directly into the camera, ensuring they saw absolutely no bluff in my eyes. You have exactly 15 minutes to draft the binding resolution, circulate the electronic signatures, and email the finalized document to my legal counsel. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not attempt to soften the blow with modern corporate jargon about finding mutual synergies or aligning our strategic visions. I simply presented them with the absolute, uncompromising physics of the situation. They had eagerly built a beautiful, soaring airplane out of paper and promises, and I was the only person sitting in the dark with the actual engine. They could either formally hand over the keys to the kingdom, or they could sit back in their opulent home offices and watch the entire empire burn to the ground before sunrise. The choice was entirely theirs, but the time for talking was over. The legally binding, digitally signed governance resolutions arrived in my encrypted inbox at exactly 45 minutes past 9 in the evening. As I steered my vehicle back into the massive executive parking lot, the North Spire headquarters loomed ahead of me. The glass tower was completely illuminated against the pitch-black sky, every single floor blazing with harsh fluorescent light. It looked remarkably like a massive, luxurious ocean liner frantically taking on water in the middle of a dark, unforgiving ocean. I walked through the revolving front doors. The lobby security guards, who had watched me surrender my badge mere hours ago, simply stepped aside. My ultimate security clearance had been remotely reauthorized by the board of directors 5 minutes prior. Stepping off the elevator onto the executive level, the atmosphere of raw panic was palpable. Exhausted vice presidents were pacing the hallways with loosened ties, shouting into mobile phones that were delivering nothing but bad news. I walked directly past the area the Vantage Ritual Consultants had arrogantly renamed the Co-Creation Studio. The colorful, expensive canvases depicting brand energy and innovation slogans were still hanging on the walls, looking utterly ridiculous, suspended in the middle of a catastrophic corporate meltdown. I did not stop to gloat, and I did not acknowledge the stunned expressions of the junior executives who watched me pass. I walked straight into the primary operational war room. Graham was standing near the far wall, his flawless posture entirely shattered. He looked hollowed out, staring blankly at the dark monitors. I did not offer him a single greeting. I did not even look at his face. I simply walked to the head of the heavy mahogany table, opened my laptop, and initiated the secure video bridge to the waiting board of directors. The legal transfer of authority is confirmed, I announced to the grid of digital faces on my screen. I am now taking manual control of the enterprise architecture. I reached out and placed my right index finger firmly onto the biometric scanner embedded in the master console. The machine emitted a sharp, acknowledging chime. The massive screens covering the walls of the war room instantly flickered from a dead, empty gray to a brilliant, deep blue. I am not going to execute a blanket restoration, I informed the board, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. When a patient goes into cardiac arrest, you do not just pump them full of adrenaline and hope for the best. You verify the integrity of the system, organ by organ, layer by layer. I initiated the first sequence. Unlocking the collateral validation layer, I called out. On the main screen, columns of verified physical asset data began to flow cleanly through the network. Next, initializing the margin certification protocols. The screen flashed green as the true, unmanipulated regional profit margins were locked into the master ledger. While the system systematically brought itself back to life, I mirrored a specific set of data onto the largest monitor in the room. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of the containment mode's intended function. "I want every member of the board to look at these logs while the network reboots," I stated clearly. "This architecture did not crash due to a legacy flaw. You are looking at the precise digital footprint of a machine doing exactly what it was engineered to do." It detected a massive, fraudulent injection of manipulated forecasts, and it dropped an iron wall to prevent that toxic data from poisoning our banking relationships. "The system saved you from committing federal wire fraud." Graham suddenly stepped forward into the frame of my camera, his voice shaking with a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim his lost authority. "Leah, this public display is entirely unnecessary. The board and I can sit down tomorrow and discuss this. It was merely a fixable misunderstanding regarding future revenue alignment and market velocity." He did not get the chance to utter another buzzword. Marlene Wexler's voice blasted through the overhead speakers, cutting through the room with the force of a physical blow. "Sit down and close your mouth. Graham." "Madam Secretary, you are to immediately record in the official corporate minutes that Graham Bellamy is hereby suspended from all duties, effective this exact second, pending the formal, irrevocable termination of his contract for a gross breach of fiduciary duty." Graham froze, the remaining color draining completely from his face. He finally understood that there was no narrative left to spin. I turned back to the console and executed the final commands, re-establishing the Treasury bridge, opening the route profitability gates, and finally, unlocking the commercial pricing engine. It was as if I had suddenly restored the oxygen supply to a suffocating giant. The absolute silence in the room was broken by the rapid, consecutive chiming of incoming notifications. My secondary screen lit up with direct messages from the reinstated department heads. Dexter reported that the Wall Street banking syndicate had received the cleansed data packets and officially removed the severe risk red flags from our revolving credit accounts. Naomi confirmed that the regional sales teams were successfully generating binding profitable quotes for our strategic clients in Nashville and Chicago. Down on the ground level, the dispatch yards reported that the algorithms were green-lighting the heavy transport vehicles. The massive fleet was actively preparing to roll out onto the interstate highways before the sun came up. The company was springing back to life, heartbeat by heartbeat. The chairman of the board cleared his throat over the video bridge, attempting to project a calm, authoritative demeanor. "Leah, we owe you a profound debt of gratitude. Given the sudden executive vacuum we now face, the board of directors has convened a rapid side session. We are prepared to formally offer you the position of interim chief executive officer, effective immediately." It was the ultimate prize, the shiny crown that almost any corporate executive would have eagerly snatched after orchestrating such a flawless victory. But I looked at the digital faces of the men who had so easily handed the keys to a charismatic fraud just months prior, and I felt absolutely no desire to sit in that specific chair. "I respectfully decline," I answered without a fraction of a second of hesitation. The room fell silent in shock. "I did not negotiate for the Chief Strategy and Resilience Officer title simply as a stepping stone," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "I accepted this role because this is exactly where the actual, physical mechanics of this empire reside. The chief executive chair is too easily swayed by market optics and the endless demand for beautiful stories. I am going to stay right here, in the engine room, and I am going to force this company to restructure around one single, unbreakable law. From this moment forward, no grand corporate growth story will ever be permitted to stand higher than our fundamental operational truth." The climax of this war did not end with me screaming in triumph or demanding that Graham grovel at my feet. True, absolute power does not require theatrics. I simply gestured to the facility manager standing nervously in the doorway. "Tomorrow morning, I want every single piece of innovation theater stripped from the walls of this floor. Rebuild this war room exactly the way it was before the consultants arrived." 2 large corporate security guards stepped into the room and quietly escorted Graham toward the exit. He did not say a word as he walked out into the brightly lit hallway, looking like a man who had just woken up from a very long, very expensive dream. I stood alone at the head of the mahogany table. I glanced down at my silver watch. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. I reached over to the side table, picked up a fresh cup of dark, scalding coffee, and took my very first sip of the day. The bitter, grounding taste brought everything into sharp focus. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling logistics yard below, watching the headlights of our freight trucks finally beginning to move out into the night. I realized then that there are massive companies in this world that are never destroyed by fierce external competitors or vicious market forces. They are completely dismantled from the inside, systematically torn apart by arrogant people who firmly believe they can casually drive a massive, complex machine they have never truly taken the time to understand. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you are tuning in from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.